The first thing I heard wasn't a machine. It was my sister's voice, low and careful, the way she used to talk when she was lying to our mother about where she'd been. She'd want us to handle it, she was saying. She'd want it dealt with properly. Then a man's voice, my brother-in-law flatter, just get the signature sorted before the long weekend. I couldn't open my eyes. I couldn't move my hand. Somewhere above me, a monitor was counting my heartbeats out loud, and I lay there underneath all of it, awake in a way they didn't know was possible, listening to the two of them divide me up like I was already in the ground. My name is Maren Keller. I'm 31. I investigate insurance fraud for a living, which is a fancy way of saying I spend my days proving that people are lying about loss. I've sat across from widows who weren't widows and watched men limp into my office on legs that worked fine the second they got to the parking lot. I thought I'd seen every shape that greed could take. I hadn't seen this one. I hadn't imagined it could wear my sister's face and stand at the foot of my hospital bed at Sunnybrook with a folder of documents and a pen. 3 weeks before that morning, I slipped on black ice outside my own front door. It was the second week of February in Toronto, the kind of cold that makes the snow squeak, and the city hadn't salted my street yet because my street never made anybody's priority list. I went down hard on the back of my head on the concrete steps. A neighbor found me. Subdural hematoma. Emergency surgery, swelling they couldn't get ahead of, so they put me into a medically induced coma to give my brain room to settle. 17 days. That's the number they kept repeating to me afterward like it was supposed to mean something. 17 days I was gone, and in 17 days you can do a remarkable amount of damage to a person who can't sign her own name. I should explain the house because the house is where this whole thing turns. I bought it 5 years ago, a narrow semi in Leslieville with a crooked porch and a kitchen somebody had wrecked in the 90s. I paid for it with money I'd scraped and saved and argued for, and I gutted it myself over 2 winters with a contractor named Lou who took payment in cash and lunch. My family thought it was a mistake. My mother said a single woman didn't need to be carrying a mortgage like a man. My sister said the neighborhood would never come up, which it did enormously, which I suspect is part of what happened later. But it was mine. Every brass fixture, every board I'd sanded on my knees. The kitchen especially. East-facing, so the light came in over the sink in the mornings, and I'd stand there with my coffee before work and feel for a few minutes like I'd built a life that couldn't be taken back. And behind the pantry, where the original chimney chase used to run, there was a door. Here's the part people don't understand until I tell them what I do. 3 years ago, before I'd really finished the renovation, someone broke into the house while I was on a job in Thunder Bay. They didn't take much, but they took a client file I'd brought home, and that file had personal information in it that I was responsible for. It nearly ended my career. After that, I stopped trusting drawers and filing cabinets and cloud accounts I didn't control. When Lou closed up the old chimney chase, I had him frame in the small reinforced room behind the pantry shelving instead. A steel door faced to look like the back wall, no handle. A magnetic latch you had to know to press. Inside, I kept the things I couldn't afford to lose. Backup drives. Original documents. A fireproof box bolted into the slab. A cash float. Because I'd learned that the worst moments of your life rarely happen when the banks are open. And after my grandmother died last spring, I kept her things in there too. Her ring. Her coins. The original of her will. Nobody knew about that room. Not Lou, really, beyond the framing. Not my mother. Not my sister. Not the man my sister married. They knew about the cameras, vaguely. The way people know you have an alarm system. What they didn't think about, what almost nobody thinks about, is that a security camera doesn't care whether you're conscious. It just keeps sending its little stream up to a server, day after day, whether you're standing in your kitchen or lying in a bed at Sunnybrook with a tube down your throat. So, the morning I woke up, I didn't wake up the way it looks in films, all at once with a gasp. It came in pieces over a couple of days. Light first, then sound, then the ability to track a finger with my eyes, then the slow horror of being able to think clearly while still being unable to talk. By the time I could rasp out a few words, I'd already heard enough fragments to know that something was very wrong. A social worker mentioning a substitute decision maker. A nurse named June saying gently to someone in the hall that families sometimes move too fast. My sister's voice, every visit, bright and managerial, "Don't worry about anything, we've got it all in hand." The first full sentence I managed to put together wasn't about pain. It wasn't about water, though God, I wanted water. I croaked out, "Where is my phone?" And my mother, who was there that day, dabbing at her eyes, patted my hand and said, "Oh, sweetheart, you don't need to worry about any of that right now. We've been taking care of everything." Everything. That word again. They kept using that word. It took me 2 more days to get my hands on a tablet, and I did it the way you do anything in a hospital, by being polite to the right nurse at the right hour. June brought me one from the family room when my mother had gone down to the Tim Hortons in the lobby. I logged into my camera server. My hands were shaking, and not only from the medication. I want to tell you what I saw, but I keep getting stuck on the smell I imagined, which is ridiculous because a camera doesn't carry smell. My living room was empty, not tidied, empty. The couch was gone. The rug my grandmother had hooked by hand was gone. There were pale rectangles on the walls where my pictures used to hang, and a roll of blue painter's tape sitting on the floor, the way it sits when someone is getting a house ready to show. In the master bedroom, my dresser was gone. The hall camera caught 2 strangers in coats walking through with a real estate agent, the agent pointing up at the crown molding I'd installed myself, and a little MLS lockbox hung on my own front door like a tag on a body. They were selling my house. I scrolled back. I watched the whole thing in fast, sick rewind. The movers, the estate sale woman with her stickers, my sister directing traffic in my front hall in a coat I didn't recognize, my brother-in-law carrying out boxes. I watched my mother stand in my kitchen and cry into her phone, and then I watched her stop crying the instant she lowered it and check her lipstick in the dark window. And then I did the thing that probably kept me alive in some way that has nothing to do with my brain. I made myself stop looking at what was gone and look at what was still there. The pantry camera, the one I'd mounted high in the corner pretending it was a smoke detector, was still streaming. The shelves had been pulled out and stacked against the wall. The estate woman had clearly cleared them for the sale, but the back wall behind them was untouched, smooth, sealed. The steel door was right where I'd left it, invisible to anyone who didn't know to press the lower left corner at exactly the right height, and the little latch indicator I'd installed, a thing only I would recognize, glowed its steady, undisturbed green. They'd taken everything they could see. They had no idea what they couldn't. I lay back against the pillows and felt something in me go very quiet and very cold, and I'm not proud of how good that cold felt. For 3 weeks, I'd been a body. Now I had a problem to solve, and solving problems is the one thing I have always been able to do. Here is what I knew, lying there. Years ago, before any of this, I'd done what my accountant told me to do and signed a continuing power of attorney for property. You're supposed to. It's responsible. I'd named my sister, because at the time, naming my sister felt like the adult thing to do, and because I genuinely believed that family meant something would catch you if you fell. A continuing power of attorney is exactly that. It continues to be valid if you become incapable. The whole point of it is that it works when you can't say no. When I went into that coma, my sister became, on paper, me. She could deal with my bank. She could list my house. She could sign for the sale. And she had moved in 17 days with a speed that told me everything about how long some part of her had been waiting. But, and this is the thing, nobody who isn't me would have known to think about in a hospital bed. A power of attorney for property doesn't make you the owner. It makes you a fiduciary. It means you have to act in the best interest of the person who's incapable. You can't loot the estate of the living. The Substitute Decisions Act doesn't say, do whatever you want with your sister's life while she's unconscious. It says the opposite. And the second I was capable again, that power could be revoked. The trick was proving I was capable. The trick was getting a doctor to put it in writing before anyone realized that the asset they'd been treating as a corpse had sat up and started taking notes. I didn't tell them I was thinking clearly. That was the first decision, and it was the most important one. When my sister came in that afternoon, I let my voice come out slow and confused. I let her think the surgery had taken something. I asked her, vaguely, where my couch was, and watched her smooth her face into compassion and tell me the house had been too much for me to manage right now, that they'd made the hard choices so I wouldn't have to, that the sale would free me up to focus on getting better. She actually used the word blessing. She said the timing of the offer had been a blessing. I said, oh, and let my eyes drift to the window, and she relaxed. Because to her, I just confirmed I was still the soft, broken thing she needed me to be. The sale, I learned by listening over the next 2 days, had not closed yet. There was a conditional offer accepted. Financing condition, home inspection, closing scheduled for the end of the month. In Ontario, a deal like that isn't final until it closes and the keys change hands, which meant the house was, for a window of about 19 days, still mine. And it meant the room behind my pantry was, for that same window, still reachable if I could get to it before strangers owned the walls around it. 19 days. I started counting them the way I'd been counted too. The next morning, I asked June, very quietly, whether the hospital had something called a capacity assessor. She gave me a long look. Nurses see everything. And she said yes. And she said I had the right to ask for one, and she said it like she was handing me something heavier than a tablet. I asked her not to mention it to my family. She nodded once. I've thought about that nod a lot. I don't know her last name. I owe her more than I'll ever be able to say. Dr. Okafor came 2 days later. A capacity assessment isn't a quiz. It's a careful conversation about whether you understand your own affairs and can appreciate the consequences of decisions. I understood my affairs better than anyone alive. By the time she left, she'd documented, in the kind of formal language that holds up in a courtroom, that I was mentally capable of managing my own property. That single sheet of paper was the lever I'd been reaching for. The moment it existed, the power of attorney could be revoked. And any authority my sister thought she still held over my life was a clock that had already started running out. I didn't revoke it that day. I want to be honest about this part because it's the part where I stopped being only a victim. If I revoked the power of attorney the moment I could, my sister would find out, and she'd stop. She'd quietly walk the donation money back into some account, cancel the listing, return the ring to a drawer, and apologize in that wet performing way she had, and everyone would tell me I should be grateful she'd stepped up while I was sick. She'd get to keep being the good daughter, and the next time something happened to me, she'd do it again, smarter. I didn't want her stopped. I wanted her caught. So I let the clock run and I started building the case. It was the donation page that decided it for me. My brother-in-law had set it up while I was still under, and my sister was its tearful face. I found it on the third afternoon, after I'd talked June into bringing me my own phone from the locker where they'd stored my things. They'd never thought to take it, because to them I was furniture. There was my sister, filmed in my own empty living room, standing exactly where my couch used to be, telling several thousand strangers that her baby sister had suffered a catastrophic brain injury, and that the family was struggling to cover round-the-clock private rehabilitation and in-home care that our system simply doesn't pay for. She cried at the 40-second mark. She'd clearly practiced. The page had a goal of $50,000, and it had raised, by the time I found it, just over 61. I sat in that bed and read the comments from people who had given $50 they probably needed, telling my sister she was an angel, telling her our family was so lucky to have her, and I had to put the phone face down on the blanket and breathe through my mouth for a while. Because here's the thing my sister either didn't know or didn't care about. My hospital care was covered. I live in Ontario. OHIP per the surgery and the ICU and the ward. And beyond that, I'm not careless, I'm the opposite of careless. I had a critical illness policy and long-term disability coverage through my own work that I'd bought precisely because I spend my days watching what happens to people who don't. The rehabilitation she was raising money for was already paid for. There was no gap. There was no struggle. There was a woman standing in my house, telling the country I was dying so she could collect on the sympathy. And there was $61,000 sitting in an account I would later learn had my brother-in-law's name on it, not a single dollar of which had ever touched a single bill of mine. And then, 2 days after that, I found the listing for the ring. My grandmother, Gran, I only ever called her Gran, raised me more than my parents did in every way that mattered. She'd left me a few things. A small sum, a half-share understanding about the family cottage up past Gravenhurst, a roll of gold maple leaf coins she'd bought one a year for decades, and her ring, a deep Ceylon sapphire flanked by 2 old diamonds. The one my grandfather had given her in 1961 and she'd never once taken off until the week she died, when she pressed it into my palm and told me to keep it somewhere safe. I'd kept it somewhere safe. I'd kept it behind the steel door. So when I saw it listed at a Toronto estate auction house, photographed against gray velvet described as an heirloom Ceylon sapphire ring, deceased estate, consigned by family with the proceeds, the listing actually said this, to assist with a relative's medical recovery. I understood 2 things at once. The first was that they'd somehow gotten into the room. The second, when I checked the pantry camera with my heart in my throat, was that they hadn't. The door was still sealed, the indicator still green, which meant the ring in that photograph wasn't mine. It took me an embarrassingly long minute to understand. Then I did. Gran hadn't owned one sapphire ring. She'd owned the ring, and a copy she'd had made decades ago. Paste, set in silver, for traveling, because she didn't like wearing the real one to airports. The real one was in my safe room. The copy had been in a jewelry box in my bedroom, which my sister had cleared out with everything else, and which my sister had assumed was the real thing, because my sister had never once in her life paid enough attention to anyone but herself to know the difference. She was about to defraud an auction house by selling a fake as an heirloom on top of everything else. I almost laughed. It was the first time in 3 weeks I'd felt anything that wasn't grief or calculation. I let it happen, the listing. I let her hang herself with it. By the end of that first week of being awake, I had a plan. And I had help. The help came first from a man I'll call Marcus, a forensic accountant I'd worked beside on a dozen cases and trusted more than most of my family. I called him from the hospital bathroom with the fan running. I told him everything in the flat, fast way you talk to someone who does this for a living, and there was a silence on the line, and then he said very quietly, "Maren, we're going to bury them in paper." I paid his retainer in cash from the float in the safe room. But I'm getting ahead of myself, because getting into that room is its own piece of the story. The lawyer came next. Priya Nair, an estates litigator a colleague swore by, who came to the hospital herself rather than make me struggle into her office. I laid out the timeline for her on the rolling bedside table. The power of attorney. The capacity assessment from Dr. Okafor. The pending sale that hadn't closed. The donation page, the auction listing, the camera footage. She listened without writing much down, which I've learned is what the very good ones do, and at the end she said 3 things that I have not forgotten. She said the capacity assessment meant I could revoke the power of attorney immediately, and the moment I did, my sister had no legal authority over anything of mine. She said that what my sister and brother-in-law had done wasn't a family squabble. It was potentially breach of fiduciary duty, and in the case of the donations and the bank withdrawals, fraud, and that fraud over $5,000 is a criminal matter in this country, not a civil one. And she said the words I'd been waiting to hear without knowing it. The sale hasn't closed. We can stop it. Stopping it required me to do something I'd been dreading and craving in equal measure. It required me to go to the house. I checked myself out against the gentlest possible medical advice 11 days after I woke up, with a list of warning signs in my pocket and a head that ached if I turned it too fast. Marcus drove me. The first thing I did was not go inside. The first thing I did was sit in the car across the street from my own front door, with that obscene little lockbox hanging off it, and let myself shake for a few minutes where no one could see. Then I stopped, because shaking wasn't useful, and we went to deal with the buyers. I'd already reached them. Through Priya, I'd had a letter sent, formal, careful, disclosing that the sale of the property had been executed under a power of attorney that I, the owner, now disputed, that I had been incapable at the time and was no longer, and that I intended to revoke the authority under which the agreement had been signed. The buyers, a young couple I'll call the Donovans, were not villains. They were two terrified people who'd put a deposit down on a house and were now being told the whole thing might be a fraud. We met them at a coffee shop on Queen East, the four of us, and I told them the truth, plainly, and I watched the color go out of their faces. I'll be honest about what I offered them, because it matters. I didn't threaten them. I told them they could walk away clean, that I would not contest the return of their deposit and would cover their inspection costs out of my own pocket, and that in exchange I needed two things. I needed them to agree the sale would not close, and I needed, before anything was finalized, supervised access to my own home to retrieve secured personal property that had never been part of the listing and had no business being transferred to anyone. The husband asked, carefully, what kind of property. I told him there was a built-in security room behind the kitchen pantry that the listing agent had never disclosed because the listing agent had never known it existed, and that it contained documents and family valuables that belonged to me and to my late grandmother's estate. I watched him and his wife look at each other. I watched them decide they wanted no part of whatever this was. They agreed to everything. An hour later, I stood in my own kitchen for the first time in a month. In the long, low February light, I'd built that whole room around, and it was empty, and the emptiness was worse than I'd let myself imagine. But I didn't have time for it. I knelt by the back wall of the pantry, found the spot with my fingers the way you find a thing your hands know better than your eyes, and pressed. The wall let go with a soft, magnetic sigh, and the door swung in, and the cold, dry, climate-controlled air of that little room breathed out at me like the house itself exhaling. Everything was there. The drives on their shelf. The fireproof box bolted into the slab. The float of cash. Gran's coins in their plastic sleeves. And in the box, in a small gray envelope, the real ring, the deep true blue of it catching the light from the kitchen, and under it, the thing I had built this entire silent campaign to reach. The original of my grandmother's will. My sister had a copy. Everyone in the family had a copy. Gran had made sure of it because she was the kind of woman who believed that paper kept people honest, and she was wrong about that, but she'd planned for being wrong. The copies were the simple version. They said who got the cottage share and the small sums and the coins and the ring. They were what my sister had read, if she'd read them at all, and they were why she thought she understood exactly what she was risking and exactly what she'd inherit when the dust settled. The original had more. The original had a clause Gran had insisted on adding the last year of her life in language her own lawyer had drafted, that the copies summarized into nothing because nobody summarizing it had understood it was a loaded weapon. Marcus and Priya found it together that night at my kitchen counter on the bare slab where my island used to be, reading by the flashlight of a phone because the lamps were gone with everything else. I revoked the power of attorney the next morning. I did it through Priya, formally, served properly, and I'll admit I asked her what it would feel like on the other end, the moment my sister learned that her authority over my entire life had simply evaporated. Priya said, "She'll feel it like a door closing." I liked that more than I should have. What followed wasn't a screaming match. I want anyone who imagines revenge as something loud to understand that the best of it is the quietest. It was paper, like Marcus promised. It was Priya's office sending a demand letter laying out breach of fiduciary duty, the unlawful withdrawals, the fraudulent fundraising, the attempted sale of estate property, the consignment of jewelry that wasn't theirs to consign. It was a complaint to the police fraud unit with a binder of bank records that Marcus had assembled, every withdrawal time-stamped, every transfer traced from my accounts into theirs. The 61,000 in donations sitting in an account that had my brother-in-law's name and not one of my medical bills attached to it. It was a report to the auction house who pulled the ring listing within the hour and were, I'm told, extremely interested to learn it was paste. My sister called me, once, before the lawyers told everyone to stop talking. I almost didn't pick up. When I did, she was crying, and for once, it wasn't the practiced kind. She said she'd only done what she thought I would have wanted. She said I'd been dying. She said the money was for me. I let her get all the way through it, every rehearsed beat collapsing into something realer and uglier. And then I said the only thing I planned to say, which was, the hospital was covered. You knew the hospital was covered? And there was a silence on the line that lasted long enough for both of us to understand that there was nothing under it. No explanation, no version of events where she came out clean. She hung up. We have not spoken since except through people paid to speak for us. Court, when it came, was not dramatic either, and I'm grateful for that, because I'd had enough drama performed at me to last the rest of my life. A courtroom is a terrible place to lie, because a courtroom doesn't care about lighting or sympathy or the angle of your tears. It cares about records. And the records did the work. The withdrawals, the timestamps, the donation account, the capacity assessment proving I'd been competent the moment they kept treating me as gone. My grandmother's will, the real one, the original, entered into evidence with its clause intact. My sister's lawyer tried, near the end, to frame it all as a loving family overwhelmed by a crisis, and I watched the judge look at the spreadsheet of transfers and then look up over her glasses, and I knew that framing was already dead. The orders, when they came, were almost boring in their completeness. Full restitution of every dollar taken from my accounts. The donation funds frozen and a separate process opened to return them to the people who'd given them, which mattered to me more than I expected. Those $50 strangers had been robbed too. The ring returned, both of them, real and fake, and the fraud file referred onward out of my hands and into the hands of people whose job is to decide what happens to adults who steal from the unconscious. But the clause is the part I think about when I can't sleep, and I think Gran would be glad it's the part I think about. She had been afraid of exactly this. Not in detail. She couldn't have known it would be a coma, an ice storm, a house in Leslieville, but in shape. She'd watched money turn her own siblings into strangers when her mother died. So she'd had her lawyer write a provision into her estate that I never knew existed because the version everyone was given left it out as legalese. If any beneficiary of her will were found to have wrongfully taken or attempted to take property from another member of the family during a period of that person's incapacity, that beneficiary forfeited their own share, not reduced, forfeited. And forfeited shares didn't vanish, they passed to the wronged party. My sister had been due to inherit her half of the cottage up past Gravenhurst, the one we both spent every summer of our childhood at, the one place I think she ever truly loved. By trying to take my house, my savings, and my grandmother's ring while I lay unable to stop her, she triggered a clause she didn't know was there and lost the one thing the whole inheritance she was protecting. It went to me. All of it. The cottage is mine now, whole, and I drive up there sometimes in the early dark of a winter afternoon and sit on the dock in my coat and don't feel triumphant, exactly. I feel like Gran reached forward out of her own death to settle an account I didn't know she was keeping. People ask me, when I tell them parts of this, whether I forgave my mother for standing in my kitchen and crying for the camera. I haven't. I'm not sure forgiveness is the right tool for what she did. the way a hammer is the wrong tool for a screw. She wasn't the architect. She was something worse. A person who watched and chose comfort, and I've stopped expecting her to become someone she was never going to be. The house is still mine. I went back. I put the shelves back in the pantry myself, on a Saturday, with a level and a drill and a thermos of coffee, and when they were straight, I pressed the lower left corner of the back wall and felt the little magnetic sigh and looked into the small cold room where my grandmother's ring sits now, where her will sat through the worst 3 weeks of my life, waiting for me to come and need it. Then I closed it and I heard the latch catch and I left it closed. I keep coming back to the steel door because the door is the part everyone wants to talk about, and it's the part that mattered least. The room behind my pantry didn't save me. What saved me was the years of small, unglamorous choices that filled it. The backups I made when I was tired, the will I drove across the city to store properly instead of leaving in a drawer, the insurance I bought because I'd watched other people drown without it. None of that felt like courage at the time. It felt like chores. But a life is mostly chores, and the day my sister stood in my emptied kitchen and cried for a camera, every boring thing I'd ever done quietly stood up and spoke for me when I couldn't. Cause and effect is slower than people want it to be. My sister didn't fall the day she took my house. She fell years earlier, every time she decided that being seen as good mattered more than being good, until the gap between the two grew so wide that a coma was all the room she needed to step through it. And Gran rose the same slow way. She added that clause to her will out of nothing dramatic, just a clear-eyed understanding of who her own family was, and that one careful afternoon reached forward across her death to set things right. We are all writing those clauses every day, and how we treat people who can't fight back. If I learned anything strapped to that hospital bed, it's that you need 3 things, and they only work together. You need to be the kind of person who won't take what isn't yours, even when no one is watching. Because if I'd ever cut the corners my sister cut, I'd have had no clean ground to stand on. You need the sense to see clearly under pressure, to stay quiet and gather records instead of screaming, because rage feels powerful and accomplishes nothing a judge can read. And you need the plain stubbornness to keep going when your head won't turn without aching, and the easier thing, by far, would be to forgive everyone and call it peace. I had to choose over and over not to call it peace. I don't tell this story so people will go build hidden rooms. Most of us never need one. I tell it because the real vault is the character you build long before the crisis, in the years when nothing is happening to you and you could get away with being a little less honest, a little less careful, a little less strong. My sister spent those years on the surface of herself. I spent mine almost by accident, getting ready. When the ice took my footing, only one of us was standing on something that held. I'd rather you build your own ground now while it's quiet than learn its worth. The way I did.